Before the age of the internet, it's hard to fathom how mass social revolutions ever happened at all. Imagine without a telephone, but yet we go back in history. These things did occur.
Things are changing, people are talking, and why? Because of the power of ideas. By connecting ideas together, creative leaps can be made, producing some of history's biggest breakthroughs. Ideas are like organisms. They replicate, they have infectivity and spreading powers. They leap from brain to brain. They compete for the limited resources of our attention. They are the new replicator born from the primordial soup of human culture.
Repetitive and mundane jobs also happen to be the easiest jobs to technologically automate. Without money as an obstacle in a resource-based model, jobs people don't want to do will simply be automated, while jobs that involve human creativity will involve humans that get a reward from the work itself.
So behavior is viral, and values are viral. Apart from that, it's also important to realize that this train of thought is extremely self-evident. And the goal is not to convince anyone of these understandings, but to set up the condition for them to realize it for themselves. You don't impose, and if anything is really true, then we all should have the capacity to realize it on our own without feeling imposition.
I draw up the scenario like this. If I took this group of people in this room right now, and I put you on a deserted island with nothing but one coconut tree, how long do you think you reasonable people would last before it really hit the fan?
Whether it be the stress of losing one's job, the lack of purchasing power, having to submit to employment, or having to suffer a hostile corporate takeover, there is a relationship between these stressors, your health, and the amount of inequality that exists around you.
In a 1992 Gallup poll, more than 50% of American adults, 94 million Americans, volunteered time for social causes at an average of 4.2 hours a week, for a total of 20.5 billion hours a year. And that study was done in an environment where people also have to work for money in order to live. So imagine what type of creative and innovative work you might be excited to contribute to if your needs were met at a high standard of living.
This is why we propose a resource-based economy. Money is not scientific. It's made up. It no longer works as a positive force in society, instead dividing, blocking, and usurping human ingenuity that has been present since the absence of money as a motivational force. Tesla didn't do it for the money. Armstrong wasn't a radio genius since his teens because of the money. Galileo didn't do it for the money. Martin Luther King didn't do it for the money. If you're only doing it for the money, it's probably not worth doing to begin with.
Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips, from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there, guys. The introduction for today's show was the introductionary video for London ZDay, which has just passed. It went fantastically, and as well as could have possibly been expected. We had some excellent talks from some great speakers. General sort of lineup. We had Ben Dyson from an excellent group called Positive Money, talking about fractional reserve banking and a sort of, I would argue, transitionary but very necessary first step to democratize money creation, put it in the hands of the people, so to speak, have a sort of intermediary body between government and the banks and the monetary interests to oversee, if you will, the amount of money that gets created democratically for what the public would like to see, and return banks to being sort of a intermediary between savers and borrowers. I know it doesn't solve the root cause of the problem, and that's something the movement would certainly argue, but considering that the quantitative easing package, by their estimates at least, burnt a hole of £375 billion in the coffers of the British economy, it does seem to be quite an important first step to stop wasting that volume of cash. And actually, of course, most of it has gone to the upper percentile of the upper percentile of the richest people in this country. Not that you would know that that is anything like an issue in the current election campaign being waged in this country, because clearly it's all the immigrants are the problem over here at the moment, as you'll hear in the rhetoric on mainstream media, which will almost make you bash your head against the wall in frustration. Of course, because we are all immigrants. I try to remind people that we're all African, which does get a little bemused look from most people, but there you go. We try. So anyway, moving away from that, I think positive money, I've done a very, very quick summarization. I'm sure you could project into that and object and say, hang on, that wouldn't work because there's vested interest, and I would certainly concur on probably some of those points. But what are you going to do, eh? We've got to get going somewhere, and it seems that we're fighting this battle with one hand tied around our proverbial whatsits here, because without having the power of money creation for social concern, then we can't show the public just how rotten this fractional reserve banking type of money creation actually was, and how we must really make sure to never do that again. And then we can start to build on this transition in a really meaningful way and start to fund some big scale projects, which, you know, there's no shortage of good ideas out there. But for me, personally speaking, I think in transitionary terms, if we're not sure of how to build a transition, possibly the best first step we could take is to just advocate for some type of monetary reform. Now, I know this treads on the movement toes, and I know very well why, but we've got to fight within the context of the game that we're playing now to a certain extent, whilst promoting, of course, a natural law resource-based economy and all of that good stuff. But I think some rhetoric that the public could get on board with might be monetary reform as a first, especially if we can deliver just how much money is being wasted through the current monetary creation practice, and just how much of it actually ends up being funneled to the top. A recent report here in the UK of our particular rich and wealthy elite class puts their estimated wealth at 512 billion now, an increase of 112%, I believe, in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's just laughable that they have the temerity to start to blame this on immigrants. Anyway, moving on. The first speaker of the day was David Dan. His first talk very well outlined the premises of the movement, why TZM exists, what it advocates, and David has taken on the role of UK chapter coordinator, which is really great, and it's something that we've been pushing under the rug, and no one was really heading up anything, which meant that our structure here in the UK was a little bit, not structured, basically, and it doesn't really help to get things done. So the overall overarching aim of ZDay this year in London was to rectify that, get people involved, remind them why we're still important, because we've been giving a lot of attention to third-party organisations over the last few ZDays, and that's all well and good, and we still support them, and we put out some of their links and things so that people can get involved with them if indeed the movement isn't for them, or if they just want to do it on top of what they're doing for the movement. But I think we need to really bring people back to focus and say why the educational imperative that the movement takes is so critical and so important. And that was really the complete focus of my talk on the day. And then we also had David Wood from the London Futurists, excellent speaker we've featured several times on the subject of technological unemployment. Always has some new and interesting advances in technology that I'm certainly never aware of when he turns up to speak about these subjects. And that was an excellent talk, a subject we're all familiar with, of course. We had Martin Wilkinson from the Equality Trust, brother of Richard, who we featured in our works on the effects of income inequality on human health, but he also linked that very interestingly to environmental problems such as global warming, which was very interesting to sort of see. And then there was Dave Lucas's talk, who is a member of the UK chapter here, and he spoke about the work of Jeremy Rifkin and the Third Industrial Revolution, as well as zero marginal cost, and how some of these trends and the new coming age of energy distribution, like laterally scaled energy distribution, and the Internet of Things on the collaborative commons is really going to make vast disturbing forces within the market system in times to come if people embrace that particular idea. Very interesting model of transition, I think, that Jeremy Rifkin puts forward, and I certainly recommend checking out those materials. And perhaps Dave Lucas's talk is the best place to start off. Those talks are currently being edited by the very wonderful Stephen Obrey, and I'm hoping that they'll be available to put out on our channels soon. So that was a general sort of oversight of what happened on ZDay. As I said earlier, it was to get people involved because we certainly have positions now to fill. We've sort of drawn up a skeletal structure of what we'd like to see here in the UK, and roles for people to take on in our street team and chapter coordinators around the country. We want to have regular meetings again on TeamSpeak. I think we've discussed having the UK chapter meetings on the same evening as the international meetings so that we can have it before, discuss what we need to, and then David, our UK chapter coordinator, can go into those meetings and prepped and prepared, and we can kind of consolidate it all onto the same night. And we've had other people so far step forward as well into some of those roles, and that's really positive to see. So if you want to get involved in anything in the UK, now's the time to do it. You can get in touch with myself or David Dan and see how to get involved. But do be patient with us at this time. We've had a few issues with our website and what have you, and we're just trying to bring that back together. In terms of getting involved in the very near future, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, there's an election going on here in the UK, and we've got a nice little infographic that we're using for some of our street stalls at the moment called None of the Above. So it's got a picture of the politicians who are running in this campaign, with the words "None of the Above" written below them, and then below that the logo of the Zeitgeist movement. Stick that on the front of your stalls and see what happens. I don't know what will happen, but I certainly, if I was one of the people who was thinking of voting, or perhaps was disillusioned with this system, I'd certainly be inclined to come over and ask the question, well, if it's none of the above, then what's the option? Brilliant segue into what we talk about and starting up a conversation. For the remainder of this show, I'm going to be reading the next couple of articles from the Mind in the Making section of TZM Education, which is a website set up by myself and my girlfriend to give movement members the resources needed to go into educational institutions and discuss these ideas. Very often people send me emails and messages saying, how do I get involved? And really the only thing I've got to say is, well, go to the website, because we've put absolutely everything you could possibly ever wish for on there. It's a very comprehensive outlay of what is needed to actually go into schools and discuss these ideas. So please do go and visit that at www.tzmeducation.org for more details. As I've said many times before, we really should be focusing on communicating with people who are likely to get what we are talking about, rather than wasting our time talking to people who will probably never understand it. The only benefit I can ever see in that is that you're sharpening your communicative skills, perhaps, or genuinely trying to find fault in this idea, which is a good thing to do. It's the bedrock of science, is to be skeptic and curious and creative all at the same time. So that's absolutely fine if you consciously know you're doing that, but I'm not so sure. I've got my suspicions that we just get angry and end up in a sort of 6-hour to and fro with a Stefan Molyneux fan, which really, guys, is not that productive. Let's go out to some organisation or group that actually maybe gives half a shit what we're saying. I think that might be a good idea. I would also say, within the same breath, that of course going into schools and talking to kids who haven't had their mind quite as polluted by this system as yet, and asking them the question of why is it that we have all this technology available to solve human and environmental problems and yet we're not using it. And they'll come up with the answers all on their own. Good old Socratic questioning to the rescue. So, do get involved with that. It's a most rewarding experience, and don't worry about screwing up. This is a really critical thing just to throw in there. People go, oh no, that's nerve-wracking. What? That's not me, can't do it. Well, it wasn't me either until I stood up in front of 180 kids at a school, messed up my presentation, and looked like an absolute idiot in front of everyone. And then I did it again, and the next time I was a bit better, but only marginally less crap. Until now, I'm pretty good at it, if I do say so myself. On about the 17th or 18th attempt, I'm reasonable, which you'd like to think that after 18 attempts, wouldn't you? You've got to accept that part of it. If you think to yourself, well, if I'm not perfect, I mustn't do it. Well, then don't do anything. Just be a little bit more chilled out about it, and just don't worry about failure. And the same thing goes for, when we're talking to anyone about this. I've been caught out in a Q&A. I've regularly had to say I don't know, but it always boils down to the same thing, doesn't it? Essentially, society is generally based around some sort of decision-making protocol, and I always say, well, if you can think of one that's better than the scientific method, I'm all ears. And usually people go, no. I'm like, well, then we kind of need to work out how to get this shit done, don't we? I know that sounds dreadfully simplistic, and perhaps it is, But that's ultimately what this really rests on. It rests on something very simple that children can understand, but adult minds tend to be reasonably more polluted towards. Anyway, I'll stop rambling and get on with the next article from Minds in the Making. So this is article number 7 of 10, and this is entitled Building the Perspective for a Positive Future. As mentioned in the article Education Reflects Culture and Culture Reflects Education, the tendency toward creating an education system in line with the dominant interests of the surrounding culture needs to be appreciated before any meaningful discussion regarding educational reform can properly take place. In our current competitive, hierarchical, scarcity and inefficiency-based structure, it should therefore hopefully come as no surprise that the coercive top-down hierarchy found in the workplace is mirrored in our school system. This would no longer need to be the case in an NLRBE, as the values of the population would reinforce the structure of that system and vice versa in much the same way. This is not to say that an NLRBE will be a system without some form of authority, but this issue is one of semantics. The important stipulation to make is whether that authority is legitimate or illegitimate. For example, we give people positions of authority every time we go to the doctor, the dentist, or we call a builder or a plumber. These people are trained experts in their respective fields. In this regard, there would be an authority of sorts, but the difference would be that such positions would be granted through the person demonstrating to their peers a thorough understanding of the area they are dealing with. A system of shared interests. In an economy which directly links human need to economic and social practice, the gravitation would instead be toward inspiring children to become enthusiastic, innovative problem solvers in all areas pertaining to human, environmental and social health, rather than the often myopic view to get a well-paid job regardless of the merit to wider social health. Rather than the one-size-fits-all approach to education we see today, an NLRBE could provide a far wider range of relevant educational approaches to suit as wide a range of individual preferences as possible. The rigidity of evaluating educational abilities in a standardized way through tests and grades would no longer need to be the default position for measuring educational attainment. This practice has perhaps been useful in our current paradigm to help quantify the abilities of employees for employers in the marketplace, but in an economic system absent of the need for forced labour to meet life needs due to the automation of laborious and dangerous labour, this practice would likely no longer serve a useful educational purpose. Pedagogy would likely take on a vastly different approach and demeanour in such an economic model. For example, current pressures on teachers to ensure that mandatory test result targets are met under the threat of compromising their mode of employment would no longer be an outstanding issue. In an NLRBE, with these pressures lifted, people would be far more likely to make their lessons interesting and intriguing through the enthusiasm they would intrinsically bring to a subject they are teaching of their own volition. This enthusiasm would spread to their students, helping to impart and foster an intrinsic interest in the subject being taught, rather than the current status quo in which both parties could perhaps suspect the other of ulterior motives brought on by economic pressures in the face of the threat of being unable to meet life needs within the price system. A culture without a vision of what the future could be is bound to repeat past mistakes. Imagining how the future might be is a key aspect in the evolution of society in general. While certain theories, such as the law of attraction, are scientifically untenable and at best wishful thinking, as is pointed out in the following video by the Messianic Maniac, perception and intention of thought undoubtedly plays a key role in manifesting our intentions into actions. This is why TZM is a communicative educational movement. If our cultural perceptions, intentions, habits of thought, and by extension the entire edifice of our socio-economic paradigm contradict the reality we would like to see emerge, then we are entering unto a fool's errand. This initial tactical step is summed up by Peter Joseph in the following video, and that video is entitled 3 Phases of the Zeitgeist Movement. This is not to play down the importance of building on-the-ground technical solutions to nullify our dependence on this system where possible, of course, but rather it is said to reiterate the importance surrounding the need to establish the patterns of thought and perspective needed for a sustainable socio-economic system to emerge. A criticism often made of NLRBE advocates is that by being educational we are not doing anything. My reply to this is that by that logic, neither is a university student studying brain surgery, and therefore they should move right along to the busy work of opening skulls. Sometimes a less facetious approach might work in this form of communication, but I would recommend proceeding with caution. A positive vision for the future. Painting a positive picture of how the future might be is an incredibly important tactic to adopt precisely because such optimism is not particularly popular in modern media and social discourse. Mainstream media understands the benefit of appealing to the fight or flight function of our amygdala, depicting apocalyptic visions of the future only too well. All of this serving to create a general climate of fear and apathy towards the potentially positive prospects the future could bring. It's interesting to wonder what the outcome might be were people encouraged to think of what a positive future might look like and went on to take steps to realise that vision instead of being met with ridicule or hostility for doing so. As the title of this section points out, surely a society without a vision of what the future could be is bound to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Taking a positive message to the next generation. This is why going into schools could make a significant impact in terms of making the transition to an NLRBE. With recent technological developments in access to media, the next generation are being exposed to this negative outlook by the media in a way never before possible. Such exposure undoubtedly has an impact on the thoughts, intentions and perceptions being created in these young minds, which will adopt and carry these perspectives forward with them into adult life. Were we, as advocates of this direction, to focus more of our efforts on imparting the positive and imaginative approach regarding the future to our children, whilst helping to give them the tools they will need to manifest this positive vision into reality, this would provide a major step towards the mindset required for an NLRBE. An air of caution. This is not to say that we should just omit telling the next generation about the risks we face in the present and in the future, because they, like the rest of the human population, get more than enough of this negative perspective via other sources, so we needn't be the harbingers of doom where it can be avoided. And why should we be? The NLRBE is a hugely inspiring and exciting prospect to imagine, whilst also being grounded in a realistic, pragmatic and practical plan for the future of human society. We should be thankful that we have, through our own unique personal circumstance, come to the appreciation of this as an idea whose time has come, and be the proud proponent of a brighter future inside a culture with no clear, positive, pragmatic or sensible direction in which to head. Avoiding the deadly disease of procrastination. Despite the invigorating and exciting prospect of this idea, many, including myself who agree with this direction, can easily fall victim to the dreaded grip of procrastination. One of the crazy parts of this tendency is just how often I find myself distracted in something meaningless rather than what I really want to strive towards. How is it that I often find myself entranced on Facebook or wasting my time in some way when I have important work to be getting on with? Work that is valuable to me and that I actually want to do. The following TED Talk outlines why this happens and some methods to use to limit its encroachment on our activities, and that video is entitled Why We Procrastinate by Vic Nithi. I realise that this is not the case for everyone, but for those of you reading this for whom this resonates, I find returning to these words of advice from Arnold Schwarzenegger come in useful, and that's the 6 rules of motivation. Not that I advocate Mr. Schwarzenegger's political views or general philosophical disposition, but as always, it is the information that matters and not the speaker. We should also take some relaxation time, exercise, and make enough time to eat nutritious food, but I've learnt the hard way that it is far better to structure this time into your life so that you feel like you are moving forward with your efforts in the most strategic, efficient, and effective way possible. What life could be like in an NLRBE, a personal account. With this spirit of imagination and positivity in mind, the following is a brief indulgence into what a day in my life might be like in an NLRBE. Being a teacher and a practitioner of music, an example of how this area close to my heart might work would be in the arrangement of music centre facilities within a community. Instead of needing an instrument at home, not that you could not keep one in your home if you wish, of course, you would instead have a vast array and variety of instruments with varied practice spaces available at a music centre. Through a virtual 3D imaging system, you could learn your instrument without the need for a tutor. This is not to say that other users would not be willing and able to offer help and advice, of course, but this system could enable a precise delivery in terms of the correct practice methodology and offer useful techniques via artificial intelligence at the appropriate time. This would then free up teachers to become involved in more specific areas of musicality and motivation, such as a technological aid, like the sort mentioned above. This would mean that music, as well as other subjects, could take on a totally different, more communal-based approach that we currently do not experience very often within a prize system. I'm a drum teacher, so I'll use this as an example of how it could work in this regard. The best and most informed drummers would be able to contribute to and design a system that could monitor your timing, groove, feel, posture, and would consult together on how best to do this. The computer may be able to give real-time advice and feedback on whether to slow down, which parts of the piece of music to isolate, and give helpful tips and advice along the way in order to improve your playing in the quickest time possible. You could have various styles and songs to play with, perhaps even 3D imagery to simulate a live environment as well. When you fancy having a go at the real thing, you could get together with some other like-minded musicians who may have been practicing the same songs on their respective instruments in a similar way. Book up one of the many rehearsal spaces and away you go. This would enable easy personal practice that would be in synchronization with other musicians, so that you all arrive at the practice prepared. Perhaps practices between yourselves could eventually take place online in real time in the future. From there, you could play one of the many different music events being put on at the entertainment centre in your city or further afield. Pausing briefly, it's funny when you mention something that you're otherwise unaware of until after you've read your article, and this is a sign of how quickly technology is actually advancing, that what I have just mentioned is actually now a reality. I think the technology is called Jam Station. Don't quote me on that, but there is actually technology, a small digital box that you can buy and plug into with your electronic instrument and play online. I think at the moment it's as long as they have a similar box and they've got a good Wi-Fi connection and all that sort of business. But actually, apparently that technology already exists. So there you go. So, back to the article. A change in teaching incentives. If I could live in an environment where music did not have to be marketed and my basic needs of life taken care of, then I would love to give away my music to all of those who wish to hear it. With my newfound spare time, I'd become inspired to help other young musicians coming through the ranks to reach their full potential. Currently, I teach the drums to anything up to 75 pupils a week, and in all honesty, I only teach some of them for the money. They simply do not practice enough to engage me in the act of teaching. I find these lessons often drag, becoming tedious and monotonous. I fully accept that this in part comes down to potential holes in my tuition methods, as I am of course not simply there to inform, but to motivate and inspire as well. This being said, and although I very much keep my teaching techniques under close scrutiny, I'd be lying if I said that it was these lessons which are the ones that I enjoy the most. However, because they turn up and pay, I have to teach them, as just like everyone else, I need to earn money to live. There have often been cases where a good student whom I enjoyed teaching and who practiced regularly had to give up lessons as they could no longer afford them. This would no longer be the case in an NLRBE, as with my life needs met, I would no longer need to spend my time with students who don't practice. I would happily try to inspire students who may be low on motivation, but sooner or later the buck stops with them. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, is a phrase that springs to mind. This is not to say that there would be any animosity between us in such a circumstance. I have often made this exact comment to serial practice offenders who are familiar with my social disposition. I tell them that I would not teach them in an NLRBE, and currently I only do so for the money. I reiterate that there would be no need to take my refusal to teach them personally. We may well be interested in other things and become friends under those circumstances instead. Amusingly, this has occasionally worked as a reverse psychological technique in getting the student to practice, as they seemingly did not like the idea that I was only doing it for the money. So, would I still teach if there was no monetary reward on offer? Absolutely. But it would not be in the rigid time structure that I'm currently forced to adhere to. This practice is not born out of any evidence-based methodology. It is simply a consequence of the monetary system's need to attribute a unit of value to your pedagogical time. The fact remains that some things can be taught in 5 minutes and others can take an hour or more depending on the needs of the student and what is being learnt at the time. In an NLRBE, I would have the freedom to converse with and give advice to other budding drummers in a fully interactive learning environment, one in which everyone is there through the true motivation to be creative and express themselves through the medium of music. You could take this sort of approach to other realms of education and see how we could build an educational system in which people's own natural inquisitiveness could be given the chance to flourish. In the meantime, this is not to say that we must necessarily suffer our fate until an NLRBE comes about. As a stockbroker once said to me, "In your job you give joy to people, I take it away." I think what he was trying to say in his own uniquely morose way was that my job is not really all that bad, and he is of course completely correct. So along with other changes I have made to my life, I'm attempting to dramatically reduce my outgoings and thus dependency on money. This has and will hopefully continue to allow me the freedom to offer my lessons through initiatives such as time banks, digital currencies and barter exchange wherever possible. These are just some of the ways I would like to ensure that I have the power to say who I teach and when, whilst also leading by example in terms of the sorts of values I would like to live my life by. I have already witnessed the positive effect this approach has had on those around me. When my prospective or current students ask why I am making such changes and I tell them, they are quick to congratulate me and agree with me on my stance. This hopefully helps them to want to stay with me for lessons as they are feeling like they are involved in a positive social venture whilst receiving the gift of learning to play music. Music as a measure of personal and social health. Staying with the subject of music, some of the many benefits of music as a tool in transition is well made in this excellent lecture at London ZDay 2014 by the frontman of English punk hardcore band Enter Shikari, Raoul Reynolds. And that is ZDay 2014, Raoul Reynolds of Enter Shikari. Music often holds a greater power in making a point hit home than mere words alone, something the following songs convey very well in my personal opinion. Please do go to the article to see those. If you would like to be a part of this positive shift in education, then please do take the time to visit the Action in Education section of this website and join this global initiative to go into your local schools and universities to communicate these ideas to future generations. I have to say, that was a rather abrupt segue into the ending of that article, but nonetheless it had some decent information in it and perspectives for you all, I hope, at least. I will be coming back to the airways of TZM Global Radio soon to read the remaining 3 articles from TZM Education, the next one being an effective communicative approach. So I would like to close with just some words that I think were pertinent to the topics I just discussed here from the book Critical Path by Buckminster Fuller. Quote, "We may soon discover that all babies are born geniuses and only become de-geniused by the erosive effects of unthinkingly maintained false assumptions of the grown-ups with their conventional ways of bringing up and educating their young. We know that the schools are the least favourable environment for learning. The home TV is far more effective, but we are allowing the big money-making advertisers to poison the information children assimilate to their 4 or 5 hours a day of spontaneous turning on, looking at and listening to the TV." Unquote. I would add the emergence of iPads and alike and internet to that list. Quote, "It is possible to identify some of the known faculties that we generally assume to be coordinate in those whom society does not concede to be adult geniuses. The publicly accredited characteristics of genius consist, for instance, of an actively self-attended intuition. The intuition, in turn, opens the conceptual and perceptual doors. With those doors self-opened, the innate faculties frequently combine and employ the individual's scientific, artistic, philosophical and idealistic imaginings in producing physically talented, logical, far-sighted and practical articulations. Leonardo da Vinci, who fortunately weathered the genius-eroding susceptibilities of childhood, manifested and coordinatedly employed all and more of such conceptual faculties and articulative capabilities. In the graphically recorded history of the last 8 millennia, as well as in the dim twilight of pre-Indo-Chinese, Mesopotamian, Egyptian and South and Central American graphic documentations of history, there have appeared from time to time individuals who grew to maturity without losing the full inventory of their innate intuitive and spontaneously coordinated faculties. These unscathed individuals inaugurated whole new areas of physical environmental transformation so important as, in due course, to affect the lives of all ensuing humanity. We shall hereafter identify such unscathed, comprehensively effective and largely unidentified individual articulators as the artist-scientists of history." Close quote. I think that there's some wise words in there, and I certainly would echo those with the sentiment of what I've just read. Without restriction of the price system, badgering people into thinking about doing it for the money rather than doing what they truly love, we would see an explosion of human creativity and progress like never before. And I think that perhaps the best way of summing that up would be with these wise words from Alan Watts. Until next time, take care, guys.
What do you desire? What makes you itch? What sort of a situation would you like? Let's suppose, I do this often in vocational guidance of students. They come to me and say, well, we're getting out of college and we haven't the faintest idea what we want to do. So I always ask the question, what would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life? Well, it's so amazing. As a result of our kind of educational system, crowds of students say, well, we'd like to be painters, we'd like to be poets, we'd like to be writers, but as everybody knows, you can't earn any money that way. Or another person says, well, I'd like to live an out-of-doors life and ride horses. I say, do you want to teach in a riding school? Let's go through with it. What do you want to do? When we finally got down to something which the individual says he really wants to do, I will say to him, you do that. And forget the money. Because if you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing, which is stupid. Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way. And after all, if you do really like what you're doing, it doesn't matter what it is, you can eventually turn it, you could eventually become a master of it. The only way to become a master of something is to be really with it. And then you'll be able to get a good fee for whatever it is. So don't worry too much. Somebody's interested in everything. And anything you can be interested in, you'll find others in. But it's absolutely stupid to spend your time doing things you don't like in order to go on spending things you don't like and doing things you don't like, and to teach your children to follow in the same track. See, what we're doing is we're bringing up children and educating them to live the same sort of lives we're living, in order that they may justify themselves and find satisfaction in life by bringing up their children, to bring up their children to do the same thing, so it's all wretch and no vomit. It never gets there. And so, therefore, it's so important to consider this question: what do I desire?